everyone. As Shannon said, my name is Lyndsay. I'm a behavioral scientist at the Center for Advanced Hindsight, and my colleague Shay is here with us as well. She's also a behavioral scientist with me. The Center for Advanced Hindsight is an applied behavioral research lab. We're part of Duke University, but we're housed on the American Tobacco campus, and we are led by Dan Ariely. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about applying behavioral science to ideas and putting sort of research into practice. And I like to start by taking 30 seconds to just tell you who I am. The best way that I know how is by using TV and movies to try to endear you to me. I don't have a traditional behavioral science background, so I was once upon a time an engineer for an oil company. I was an environmental engineer, so I did a lot of nerdy calculations on permitting and water recycling and conservation before I realized that I wanted to know more about how things in the natural world impact human health. So I became an epidemiologist and worked for the EPA for a little bit. But really found my passion after grad school in local government. So I worked on transportation and sustainability programs for a local government, but realized what I was really interested in was evidence-based policy and how we might generate that evidence based on the way that people behave. And that led me to behavioral science, but not the kind that profiles serial killers for the FBI, but the kind that take what we know about people's behavior and try to influence them, make it easier for them, bribe them in some cases to do what we want. And in my case, that's usually to get people to act sustainably and live more sustainable, environmentally sustainable lives. So to ground us in the overview, I will mostly cover a little bit of Behavioral Science 101, some insights into behavior change, and then I'll briefly touch on experimentation that I think you might be able to apply sort of as you bring your innovations to life. Traditional economists, and we ourselves a lot, like to think that humans are the ultimate rational actor, like Mr. Spock. So this conceptualization of ourselves means we can accumulate information, we can account for probabilities, we can accurately sort of normalize and weigh the costs and benefits of our actions, we maximize our own utility, and our preferences remain stable over time. But we know that in the real world, people don't operate within the confines of these perfect economic models. We are often irrational, more like Homer Simpson, and we try to do what's easy. We're very present focused. This is a theme that comes up a lot in my field of climate change. It's very hard to change behavior in the here and now for benefits that might not be realized for a long time. We're egocentric. And we're social beings, so we're really influenced by what other people think and do, even though we would like to say that we're not. So the idea behind behavioral economics and behavioral science is that knowing information alone often doesn't lead to behavior change. And that's because our environment really shapes our behavior and our choices more than information alone. And it's really important to keep in mind that we don't make decisions in a vacuum. There's a lot of stimuli in our environment that influence us and sort of pull our attention, pull us one way or the other. So knowing these things, how do we go about getting people to actually change their behavior? And we can think of behavior change strategies overall kind of in two broad categories. And I'll refer to those as reducing friction and adding fuel. Firstly, reducing friction kind of boils down to making it easy for people to behave in the way that you want them to. So we want to remove unnecessary obstacles from the quote unquote right choice, the choice we're trying to get people to make. To flip that on its head a little bit, you can also think about adding friction to the wrong choice. So this is a strategy that you might see quite a bit in like subscriptions. If you've wondered why it's such a pain in the rear end to cancel a subscription. I tried to cancel a subscription recently, had to fill out a survey, had to email someone. They told me it's going to be really expensive if you decide to come back, you're going to regret it. That's all their way of adding friction to that process to try to get you to kind of remain in the subscription. So this is a classic behavioral science example some of you may have seen before. These are organ donation rates by country in Europe. And if I hadn't primed you to think about sort of the friction element, we might draw some conclusions about the types of people that live in these countries and altruism and culture. But really what the difference here is it really came down to friction. So the countries in blue had an opt-out system for organ donation sign-up, whereas the countries in yellow were opt-in. And this is a classic example of a friction strategy called switching the default. So default bias says that people will often pick the easiest option to avoid complex decision making. And a lot of times that means making no choice at all. So not checking that box, whatever that box says, not checking it. Defaults also kind of signal what people are supposed to do. So if I point out to you that you have to take this extra step to make a choice, I'm kind of implying that people don't usually do this. The second strategy area I mentioned was adding fuel. So this might mean adding incentives, which could be financial incentives or even away from those, tying the things that people want to the behavior you're trying to get them to enact. So fuel can also be in how we frame the information that we give people, which is what the next example will be. So in this example, we worked with a loan servicer who was a credit union, and they wanted to get customers to set up a savings account while paying off their loan by having them round up that loan payment to the next $50. And that extra would go into the savings account. So we had half of the customers simply asked if they wanted to round up their loan payment and told that they'd be given this savings account. And the other half of customers were told the same thing, but around this frame of how much that account will be worth by the time they pay off their loan. So, you're missing out on having savings of $1,300 at the end. And what we found was that those who heard that framing version really had a significant increase in signups for this roundup program. And this really illustrates another common concept called loss aversion. So the framing was around the loss. This works under the idea that losses loom larger than gains, or people are more sensitive to losing something than to gaining something, even if they're of equal value. So we might frame people's decision as missing out on something else. Shannon will send around afterwards. I gave her sort of some materials that show a couple other examples of friction and fuel strategies. I just wanted to highlight these two for now, but once you kind of think about these strategies or read through them, you'll start to see them pop up a lot more, especially I've seen a lot in terms of COVID testing and vaccines. You'll start to see these kind of behavioral science concepts pop up in daily life. So these examples are cute, but how do we know what works? And this is where experiments come in. This sounds a little bit wonky, but I think purposely trying to sound more complicated than it is. But the gold standard for experiments are randomized control trials. So you take a sample of the population representative of whose behavior you want to change or motivate, and randomly assign them to at least two groups. Implement your strategy or your intervention with one of those groups, and then hold it back from the other group and compare the same outcome between the two groups to really see if what you are implementing is effective. This kind of setup is ideal because random assignment helps control for individual differences that might contribute to your outcome. And comparing to a control group helps you kind of identify that it was the intervention that works and it wasn't an outside factor to blame. So for example, let's say you're trying to get people to bike to work. So you pick out one neighborhood to send a bike helmet and another neighborhood not to. That's not random assignment. You're just picking the two the two neighborhoods as a whole. And let's say the ones who you didn't send the bike helmet to bike to work just as much as the other ones. So that could mean that the bike helmet was not effective, but it could also mean that by not randomizing, you've accidentally clustered maybe everyone who lives in a hilly area together, or everyone whose economic status is such that they don't own a bike together. And now your results are tainted because you have that variance in the population by not randomizing people to treatment and control. Another point is that very often, rather than doing an RCT, a lot of organizations and governments will do more of a before and after study. That's not to say before and after studies are terrible or not of value, they are, but they can taint your results. So let's say we wanted to know if giving people a compost bin reduces the amount of trash that they're sending to landfill. So we look at the amount of trash generated in September and October, then we give them a bin, and we look at how much goes to landfill in November and December. Again, we might not see a difference in that trash weight going to landfill. That would make us think our bins didn't work. But we've also got to keep in mind that the conditions have kind of changed over time. So we hit Thanksgiving, we hit December holidays, and maybe people are generating more food waste in general. So we're not sort of isolating that factor of giving the compost bin. So I've listed here kind of the benefits and limitations of randomized control trials. Probably the biggest benefits are the ones that I just talked about isolating what it is you're trying to really test and ascertaining if it's working. To note a couple of limitations, it's sometimes not ethical to hold back your intervention or your project from a group of people. Sometimes there's inequity concerns that some people are getting something and other people aren't. The inequity one is a little bit, there are ways to get around that. You could do a stepped rollout. So give everyone your treatment for a month, or give half the people your treatment for a month and then allow everybody else to get it. But there are also, there are times when you can't do a control group, or at least not a clean control that gets nothing. So in thinking about experimentation as it relates to Ideastarter ideas, where might you start? So the first sort of large step you can take centers around identifying. Identify the key behavior that you want someone or people to start, to stop, to do more of, to do less of, and be as specific as possible. And then think about all of the steps that it takes for a person to enact that behavior. So I know Shannon went through, I think, journey mapping, behavior mapping, super similar. Take that key behavior and go through each individual step that it will take to get there. And then look at those steps and try to think through what are the barriers that people will come up in meeting each step along the way. Those can be psychological barriers. So in recycling, it's icky to wash out my peanut butter jar. That's more of a psychological barrier. They can be process-based barriers. So I don't have a recycling cart. That's more of a process-based barrier. And then identify which barriers you think barriers are having the biggest impact on that key behavior, and those might be the ones that you're trying to overcome. The next broad step is exploration. Use the things you already know, what you hear from people in this population whose behavior you're trying to change, either through surveys or interviews, qualitative data gathering, and ideate solutions that might help them really overcome that significant barrier. There's plenty of room to kind of be big, generate lots of ideas before you narrow down and think about impact and feasibility and measurability. So it's hard to know if your thing worked if you can't measure outcomes. And then generate a hypothesis. So we think if we do this, or if we give people this, then this will happen. If we give people a compost bin, then they will send less trash to landfill. So the next step, or the final step, is the fun part is testing. So establish the sample that you want to sort of run your experiment on, determine what people in that control group will get, if anything, and how you're going to randomize people to either get your intervention or be in the control. And then think about measurement and data. So how will you know if people enacted that key behavior? And you'll need to know that for both the control and treatment group, because that's what you're comparing against each other. And once you've put your intervention out, gathered data, compared the outcomes for treatment and control, you can then kind of respond to your hypothesis. So does it look like your intervention worked? Are people's outcomes different? I know that was a super quick fly through. I also gave Shannon some materials about experimental design that are kind of an easy checklist to go through that reiterates these points. But 3 key takeaways for today. People don't always behave rationally or predictably. So relying on rationality for your ideas a lot of times might not get you to where you want to be. Reducing friction and adding fuel can help with this. And then if you can, test your solutions experimentally. I'm also going to put my contact information up here if you ever want to chat about your ideas or talk about any of these things, think through testing. I am happy to be contacted at pretty much any time. So thanks, and pass it back to Shannon, or questions or what have you.
Thank you, Lyndsay. That was so good. Do you want to take down the screen share, and then I'd love to open it up. I know that ends up being a lot. So questions, yes, Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Lyndsay. That's really helpful. So thinking about the loss aversion piece for us, so we're trying to get people to fill out a form when they are using herbicides to treat algae in a pond. And that I'm trying to think about how loss aversion applies there, because theoretically, if they don't do it, then they could be fined for it. Mm-hmm. But if they've done it in the past and never had the fine imposed, then it's a very theoretical loss to them. Mm-hmm. So is there a way to threaten them sufficiently so they feel that there's a loss there looming that they must avoid, or does that apply? Curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, so we play with this a little bit in terms of parking tickets. So if we want people to not be parking on a street that they've always parked on and rarely ever gotten a ticket, one thing you can do is kind of use more like social norms rather than loss aversion. So we've highlighted like how many tickets have been given out, or if that is a really small number, sometimes talking about sort of the trends. So, far more people are getting tickets in the last year than before. Loss aversion might be a slightly hard, I guess it depends also on the amount that fine is. It might be a little bit harder of one to play with, but social norms for sure. And then a really popular one that involves filling out forms is that defaults one, and sort of take away any unnecessary steps in the form, make it really easy, or tie it to something else that they're doing anyway. But yeah, threats are definitely, they work, but thinking about framing that around sort of the social norm is also a good way to think about it.
Thanks.
Do you have any tips for soliciting participants in experiments and also in getting them to show up for the experiment?
Yeah, so we do incentivize a good bit, and that is, there are pros and cons to incentivizing participation, depending on whose participation you're trying to get and whether that is a sustainable method of getting participants or not. Tying it to something else also is great. So if, let's see, we've had folks sign up for an app during like a school registration when they're sort of doing other things as well. That's been somewhat effective. If there's a way to do an opt-out, that's always preferable too. So if folks have to register for something and they have to opt out to not be part of your population that you're looking at, that's great. I know that that is sometimes not possible. Let me think a little bit more about that too. I'm happy to follow up with you, Katie, afterwards, because I know that we've come across this a good bit. So I might not have all my ideas out at the moment, but happy to follow up.
Any other questions? I have one that is actually, when is an RCT appropriate, given that the next step for like idea starters are to like small prototypes? And so how do you frame that, those things?
Yeah, so we usually run an actual test post prototyping. So we want to make sure that what we're putting out there is what we think is the best version of it. And I'm sure, prototyping involves taking sort of feedback and iterating, even user testing if you're able to do that. We like to do all that before actually testing it. So part of that is, there's a cost to testing a lot of times, both in terms of time and sometimes in terms of money if you're gathering data that requires, incentivizing surveys or something like that. So want to make sure that you're putting out there sort of the best version, the version that you think will be most effective before actually testing it.
And this might be sort of dependent on the kinds of prototypes or the kinds of tests, but how do you determine like the successful elements of the prototypes that you decide to push forward with the RCT?
We usually do user testing. And so we won't actually know if it's successful because user testing is, on a couple of people and won't have the numbers to know if it's successful before we put it out and test it. That is one option. Another option is, so when you're actually doing your RCT, you can have multiple treatment groups. So if you think it could be, all of these things that are successful, or it could just be this one that we think is really promising, you can divide that treatment into two groups and give someone a kitchen sink intervention and someone a more light touch intervention, and sort of look during your testing period to see, is that light touch version enough? Are we seeing enough differentiation even with the light touch as compared to the control? So we know that that sort of smaller scale version is effective, versus do we not see a whole lot of difference in that light touch, but we do when we throw the kitchen sink at them.
Thanks. Any other questions? I know there's probably a lot. I feel like I learn something new every time I listen to anything about behavioral science. So it feels like there's a lot of congruencies with like human-centered design and different tools, but it's definitely a lot of new language and terminology, kinds of rules. Since we have a few more minutes, it doesn't seem like anything's burning on anyone's lips. So I gave everyone journey mapping last week. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on how you see behavioral mapping aligning with, or maybe as a jumping off point from those journey maps?
Yeah, so admittedly, I don't always know the difference between all of the different types of mapping, the user mapping, behavior mapping, journey mapping. But I think a lot of times in journey mapping, you're kind of looking at all of the steps that you need to take and the steps everybody else needs to take in order to get to the right end point. The behavior mapping is maybe a little bit more fine-tuned to not not worrying as much about the external factors to begin with. Those are kind of parts of the barriers, but really just taking, so if I want someone to recycle their cans, putting recycling their cans at the end and then working backwards to how do you get to recycling your cans? Well, you put the cart out on the street, you put your cans in the cart, you wash your cans, you use something with a can, you buy something in a can. Really looking at each of those kind of steps in a pretty laser focused manner. And then when you're mapping sort of the barriers to each step, that's kind of when you think about the external factors, like the person has to drive a truck and collect recyclables. Someone has to, deliver cans to your grocery store or what have you. That's a little bit of a silly example, but.
No, that's good.
I have a quick question.
Sure. go ahead.
As far as the, I'm sorry. As far as the RCT experiments, how would you measure the how valid the results are with that? What factors would play into how valid the results are from that?
Yeah. One thing that can sometimes get in the way is sample size. So in order to see if it's valid, you need a certain number of people. And this depends on how effective you think the thing you're putting out there is going to be. If it's only going to shift behavior by 1 or 2%, sometimes you need 1,000 people in your sample. If you think it's going to have a really big impact, you can get away with a smaller sample, sometimes, down to like 250. But even that is sometimes a hard sample size to meet. So if you are putting something out there that could benefit, both your sample population and maybe some others in the local area, combining forces is a great way to try to get a population of a sufficient size. And then, yes, statistical analyses are sometimes, you can do extremely complicated versions. There are some kind of lighter versions, but it's important to note, I guess, even if you look at your treatment and control groups and they look different, there are some tests that you have to run to just see if that difference is due to random chance or if that difference is really there. So I would say sample size is probably the biggest impediment to seeing that, but the rest is learnable, outsourceable, all of those things.
Okay, thank you.